Hello and welcome to the Aerospace Corporation Space Agenda 2025 public briefing. I'm Jordan Bingham and I will be your host for today's event. Before we begin, I'm going to go over a couple housekeeping rules. This public briefing is all on record and is being recorded. Please keep your microphones muted throughout remarks and be mindful of device notifications. We'll be answering questions at the end of the briefing, so please drop your questions in the chat. When we get to your question, I may invite you to come off mute and state your name, organization, or ask or clarify your question. Now, to provide opening remarks, I would like to introduce Dr. Jamie Morin, who has been the Executive Director of the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, aka CSPS, since 2017. And also leads Aerospace's technical support to the Pentagon. Prior to joining Aerospace, he led analysis and resource allocation for the Department of Defense as Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. Jamie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Wonderful to have everybody here today as we roll out Space Agenda 2025. This has been a long journey. Some of you that are joining today's event have pulled me aside at other events and said, hey, it looks like CSPS publications are down a little bit this year. What's going on? Well, this is what's going on. The team has been hard at work for the last year on 16 chapters that are designed to highlight and provide insight into some of the biggest space challenges facing the nation and our policymakers. It's an effort, certainly, of the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at Aerospace and of Aerospace writ large, and also an effort that brought in a number of outside authors for whose contributions we're grateful. As most of you are probably aware, Aerospace runs a federally funded research and development center on behalf of the U.S. government. We're providing technical and strategic insight for U.S. space programs across the civil, military, intelligence, commercial sectors. We are trying to support smart decision-making by the U.S. government on everything from the policy level all the way to the technical. The Space Agenda 2025 compendium, the 16 chapters I mentioned, they're written primarily for U.S. government, space sector leaders, folks like even presidential transition teams as we move into this 2024 election and a 2025 inauguration of a new presidential administration. But I think they also provide an accessible introduction to space policy and strategic issues that affect national security, civil, and commercial space. It's not the first time we've done this. Aerospace published a edition back in 2020 as well, but we felt like we needed to do an update. We felt like we had to do an update because in the 4 years since Space Agenda 2021 was released, there's been a tremendous amount of progress on space-based applications. We're seeing rapid growth in certainly improved communications capabilities. We're seeing expansion in the way we use remote sensing technologies from space for a whole host of purposes, and including better understanding and addressing the climate change challenges facing humanity. Really, if you look across the space sector today, space technology is bringing us more closely together. It's giving us more understanding of our world than ever before. It's enabling a whole host of services that are offering exceptional opportunities to strengthen national security, improve the human condition. But our assessment is these trends are right now not yet fully consolidated, that they're still underway, and in some respects at risk. We think U.S. space leadership is critical going forward, and it remains under challenge. So this is a very important time for policymakers to shape the future. We particularly in Space Agenda 2025 focus on the transformation occurring with the infusion of commercial space capabilities into the civil and national security space sectors. That's obviously been underway for well over a decade. but it is continuing, and it is causing a rethink of government space system architectures that is still underway. And a lot of what you see in this report is really intended to grapple with and respond to that opportunity. Today, we're going to highlight just a few of the 16 chapters that are in Space Agenda 2025. There is much more beyond the handful of topics we'll dive into in this event. So I would encourage you to look at the whole product. The 16 chapters are all listed on the splash page, which will be which is public now. But hopefully we're giving you a sampling that whets your appetite and brings you back. I would encourage you, space is a growing community, but it's still a small community. You should, as an attendee here, feel free to reach out to the CSPS scholars. They are happy to answer questions and engage and accept criticism on the ideas we're laying out. We're happy to go deeper in conversation. We're happy to appear at your public events to talk about these issues. This is the start of a dialogue, not the end. So let me summarize just a few of the key things that we see happening in space today. And I'll focus in on kind of what's changing and what we need to consider as we're charting a path forward. So first, as I alluded to before, there's a lot going on in the commercial sector. Over the last several years, and you'll see this in more detail in a moment, there have been billions of dollars of venture and other private investment in space. The returns on that investment are starting to be visible. They are turning into real things. But we are also at a point where additional capital is going to be harder to get for many of the earlier stage companies that have been entering into the space sector. This raises super important questions about how can government be a more strategic buyer of these capabilities. In many, many cases, the business models of these new entrant companies depend significantly on government revenue, global government revenue, I should say. Many of the companies are US companies. Some are headquartered in allies, and some are headquartered in nations that may be our adversaries. We need to be thinking through that strategic buyer role for the government. We need to be thinking through how we can reduce legal and policy barriers to the government engaging at a strategic level with these companies. In some cases, that may mean reducing barriers to the government serving as what we sometimes call an anchor tenant buyer. It may make sense in some cases for the government to do that sort of level of engagement with the private sector and commercial players. We also need to talk about ways in which our budgetary and resource allocation processes and appropriations process create unnecessary obstacles to leveraging private sector investment in the space sector. And we need to think about how can the government be proactive in looking at what needs to be done in order to integrate these commercial technologies in our space architectures for government mission areas. So these are all tricky questions. We'll get into these in a little more detail as the conversation moves forward here today. And again, we'll continue working and researching on this. Another major trend that's underway is the fielding at scale of proliferated systems. And obviously, there's plenty of public examples of that right now. There's both governmental and commercial systems fielding at scale. This is an area of great strength for the United States. U.S. is leading in this area. But again, there are a whole host of questions that come in terms of policy and strategic approaches in the next several years as the U.S. looks to maintain that leadership and maximize its benefit for public interest. So questions like, how do we secure the supply chain and mitigate cyber risks against large space constellations? How can we work to reduce barriers to integrating these capabilities for sensitive missions like national security? How can we raise the costs for an adversary that might be considering extreme measures in order to counter these proliferated constellations? Are there norms of operation that can increase the viability and reduce the risks to these proliferated systems? And we lay out an idea that those norms need to be feasible, observable, understandable, and relevant, and that they need to mobilize coalitions across the globe in order to have a chance of becoming real and driving needed change. We also want to continue pounding on the point that delivering real capability from space requires that ground systems, software, and user equipment all come together. It is not enough to field a bright, shiny object in space. There are clear lessons that emerge from military operations in Ukraine that underscore that point. And it really gets to this fundamental point that integration of space capabilities is often far more important than the specific details of those outright capabilities. Turning to the exploration and civil space side, I just note that space exploration is clearly, again, a contested area, a competitive area with geopolitical salience. It is on the National Security Council radar screen, not just the National Space Council, if you will. During the next decade, this coming 10 years, the PRC is likely to become the second nation to land humans on the moon. The US is looking to return, of course, along with allies and aiming at a sustained presence, not just stepping on the surface kind of thing. That's, of course, a dramatically more difficult task than anything we did in the Apollo program. But there are a host of issues related to this effort that are explored in Space Agenda 2025, and we'll talk a little bit about some of them here today. We're going to open today in talking about implications of a rapidly warming world, and among them, one of the challenges of a need for greater economic activity, military and national security operations as well in a warming Arctic. And as many people on this call will know, operating in the far north, or the far south for that matter, is not something that historically satellite systems have been optimized for. We've had very specialized systems that have provided services in the far north and far south. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of operation in a warming Arctic and the need to close some gaps there. We also will be talking about the role of allies, the role of partners, a critical element of U.S. national strength and of advantage for the U.S. space sector. You may have seen recent news about some relaxation of rules surrounding export control and some addition of technologies to the less onerous areas of export control. But we'll talk about how U.S. allies are a key source of strength, but of course they're not wholly owned subsidiaries of the U.S. government. They're not, proxies, and they will of course be working to advance their own national interests even while we're cooperating. And so Space Agenda 2025 talks a bit about how to define the legal and practical boundaries of cooperation and competition with our friends. We'll talk about U.S. regulatory approaches and how they can be so critical to the long-term sustainability of the space environment, our ability to generate economic and national security advantage from space, also to the ability of the space environment to recover in the event of a conflict that extends to space. But those regulatory approaches are also critical to the competitiveness of U.S. companies, which are in turn a critical source of U.S. national strength. So this is a key area that we address in the study. And I would highlight just one point here, which is perfection in regulation is not the goal. There's an urgency to move forward with speed that is likely more important than getting those regulations precisely right. We note that detailed implementation often matters more than the words written down in a regulation or in a policy paper, and execution matters. So this is another critical theme that emerges from this study. So these are just a handful of the challenges and opportunities that are addressed in Space Agenda 2025. We didn't write this to cover every space challenge by any means, But we did try to do a survey of the horizon and a foresighting exercise to look at a range of future scenarios of the nature and state of the space domain and the global environment to help inform the topics we addressed. There's an issues map we provide in the introduction to Space Agenda 2025 and a categorization of the various issues, both in terms of a temporal dimension and in terms of how they fit into three broad categories, which we'll talk to in some length today. One is strengthening leadership and competitiveness. Another is the effort to catalyze commercial space. And a third is charting future value, including in novel mission areas and in challenging issue areas like spectrum. So it's an ambitious paper. We're really glad you were able to join us for today's rollout. Before I hand things over to Kara Cunzeman, who did the foresighting exercise, or rather led the foresighting exercise that helped us kick off this project, I did want to give a special shout out to Dr. Angie Buckley, who served as the lead editor and orchestrator for this project. Angie deferred her planned retirement from aerospace in order to bring this across the finish line. We are enormously grateful for her friendship and her leadership over her long career, and to include this important project. So Angie, all of our thanks go to you for an enormous amount of work to pull this project together. With Space Agenda 2025, we are trying to provide a framework to support and inform sound policy making for the space enterprise. That is a first step to delivering US leadership in the space domain. It's not sufficient, but we do think it's a critical first step. Across the more than 100 papers the Center for Space Policy and Strategy has published over the last several years, we're hopeful that these will be some of the most high impact. With that, let me hand things over to Kara. And again, my thanks to the whole team for all the hard work to deliver this project. Kara.
Thank you, Jamie, and welcome everybody. What an exciting day. We've all been working very hard to bring you Space Agenda 25, and just thrilled that you're here with us today to kind of at least give an overview of some of the chapters and the great insights from our experts that are being discussed. As Jamie mentioned, I am the systems director focused on strategic foresight. So I lead a team completely focused on structured methodologies for thinking about the future. And as Jamie did such a wonderful job describing the changing global environment and broader context in which we really need to take into account for critical space policies that we're teeing up for decision makers in the near term. So before we jump into hearing about some of the highlights from Space Agenda, we thought it was really important to just contextualize the broader strategic space in which we are operating and which will drive US leadership in the future. If you go to the next slide. Thank you. This is essentially kind of like our single diagram to help orient everyone across what we feel like are the most critical issues facing the United States as it looks to seed and plant and move forward a pathway for our continued leadership in space, both in the near term and the long term. And so, because aerospace has such a breadth and depth, and we serve customers across the space enterprise, we have this really unique vantage point. And, couple that with, I think, the objectivity, the bipartisanship, the deep technical analysis. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out what does a balanced portfolio really look like for the critical issues we need to be talking about, not just what the news is covering or what specific customers might be asking for, but what really, no kidding, needs to be looked at and addressed in the near term if we really do want to push US leadership forward in space, and quite frankly, beyond space. So this diagram here is shaped around three themes for which our papers are aligned to. The first is strengthening leadership and competitiveness. So we acknowledge that being a leader requires both proactive shaping across all facets of national power, but also cooperation and working with like-minded allies and partners, leveraging the commercial sector. That leads us to our second theme, catalyzing commercial space. So stimulating and ensuring that we have a viable space ecosystem now and in the future is going to ensure, again, all facets of success across the space enterprise and is really critical to our future success. And then finally, charting future value. So, we have one of our widely read papers, The Value of Space, really just showcases how incredible the value that space is bringing to the American people and globally. But what is that future value, and how are we going to plant those seeds and ensure across all aspects of things like promoting a safe and navigatable space enterprise, to space exploration, to national security, to future workforce? How are we making sure that we are seeding future value for space? So we have these three categories, but as Jamie also mentioned, we wanted to give context to decision makers about how to address these. So you can look at this diagram kind of from inside out. We have three different categories. The first is basically behind the curve, right? Things that we need to solve right now, and we need to move forward on. We also have emerging and urgent, things that are in real time playing out. As Jamie mentioned, perhaps swift movement is maybe more important than getting it 100% right, and we can tweak along the way. But lack of movement, lack of action is probably one of the riskier situations we could find ourselves. And then planting seeds. So oftentimes when we think about planting seeds for future issues, that gets kicked down the can. But what we're arguing here is that anything that is on this map has an urgency to it, needs to be addressed in the near term to seed this longer term value. So with that, we have identified, as you can see on this map, I won't go into the details on it, 20 critical issues and themes. And in the introduction report, we describe each of those in kind of moderate detail. And we link those to both the Space Agenda papers that are relevant to that topic, but also previous work done by the center. And I think it just shows, again, that, Space Agenda is one of many publications that the center has put on, and there's such a breadth and depth required to appropriately kind of contextualize all of these areas. But there's something for everybody. We have resources on very specific issues, but we also have resources for those who are trying to make sense of how do I lay this into a policy framework and roadmap at a national level. So if you go to the next slide, we have some kind of summarizing recommendations kind of out of this. Obviously, you're going to hear very quickly some of the highlights from some of the specific papers, but we also wanted to draw out across the enterprise at a national level, what are some of the key messages that we have? Well, first, we certainly hope that policymakers are going to look at this critical issues map as a guide star for approaching how they want to address policy and synchronizing timing of specific ways that they're going to address these efforts. And again, this focuses on U.S. leadership and competitiveness. We can choose to completely ignore some of these, but these are the areas that we feel are really critical if indeed we want to be leaders across the enterprise. We also recognize this need to create and clarify a broader, more whole-of-nation vision for where the United States wants to go, but also for how space can support it. And this is, of course, more than just a transactional thing. This is also about how space is going to bring value back to the American people, and that message needs to be very clear. That's really challenging to do without greater clarity about where we want to navigate writ large. And then finally, just again, this call for this fast-changing, complex, quite frankly, unpredictable environment that we find ourselves in really does require more systematic approaches in thinking about the future. And that strategic foresight really should be an embedded strategy in how we approach critical uncertainties and how we make critical policy decisions, acquisition decisions, new science and technology developments and innovation. So we really make a call for strengthening these capacities across the space enterprise and beyond to drive those necessary innovations to lead to our leadership. And in a nutshell, right, this changing context, this growing global competition, the impressive set of commercial capabilities, but the uncertainty about where that's all going, the increased capacities and interests of global players in the space arena, just make this ripe for a really unique point in time in which we find ourselves. And so we feel like the next several years are going to be really critical, and the time is now for decision makers to really start seeding and implementing, on all of these key issues. And the decisions that they're making today really are going to shape the future of space. So with that, we're going to lead into our deep dives on some of our papers. And Emma, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Kara. Next up, we have Karen Jones, a senior project leader in CSPS, where she works as a space economist and technology strategist, presenting her paper titled Space-Enabled Capabilities for Connecting and Collaborating in the Arctic.
Thank you, Emma. I wrote this paper with my colleague, Lena Cashin, and we look forward to your comments. There's a lot of changes occurring in the Arctic. It's a remote and vast region above 66 degrees north, and there's an old saying, high north, low tension, and that seems far removed from reality these days. And in fact, the race is on. The high north is definitely a competitive landscape right now, with the US, NATO allies, and Russia working to protect their territorial, economic, and military interest. And even China, a self-proclaimed near-Arctic state, is working to protect its economic investments with Russia, as well as their access to the Northern Sea Route, which is the shortest shipping passage from Europe to Asia. And some refer to Russia as China's junior partner in the Arctic, as Beijing continues to gain access to the high North's natural resources and infrastructure. So it's a crucial time for satellite systems to support affordable and persistent connectivity, navigation, and observation. And as Jamie asked, how can government be proactive to integrate these commercial systems into our government architecture? So as you can see with this map, the Arctic really has a front row seat to the effects of a warming planet. Studies have shown that the Arctic is warming up to 4 times as fast as the rest of the planet. And the melting sea ice is hastening the race for resources, which include petroleum, mining, including seabed minerals, and shipping lanes, and more. There are currently 8 Arctic nations that have a presence in the Arctic, including Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, the US, and Russia, and all have interests both for commerce and security. But there are 5 coastal countries in the Arctic, the US, Canada, Russia, Denmark, and Norway, and they're all working to extend their continental shelf claims. This is going to be key and something we'll continue to watch, and you'll see from this map that there are overlapping claims. Within this context of dynamic and a geopolitically challenging environment, we need satellites to support national security interests, vessel and maritime assistance, fishing monitoring, and enforcement of commercial fishing, a commercial fishing moratorium, search and rescue, and science and research. Next slide, please. So this graph illustrates the slow but very steady increase in satellite connectivity in the Arctic region. And back in the late 70s, we started with really basic intermittent satellite telemetry services that included Russia's GONET system and also France's Argos system. Both of these systems have expanded. However, we're also seeing several new satellite players cover the region, particularly after 2018. In addition to Starlink, we have Inmarsat, Viasat. We also have Space Norway, as well as Telesat Canada. And their service is known as Lightspeed, which is expected to go online in 2026. So we're seeing greater coverage, greater connectivity, increased broadband speeds, and more persistent availability of these services. Commercial companies have made significant investments and the US and allies should consider these existing and future commercial space capabilities to support and implement Arctic needs and policies above 65 degrees north, including the commercial services I listed. So our recommendations are based around an innovative collaboration with allies to share capabilities. We also recommend the use of open systems and flexible architectures that offer economy, security, and user flexibility. Also, the development of multi-orbit, multi-mission capability terminals and hybrid solutions. This allows us to do more with less in some ways. Also, satellite networks that can handle robust data transmission capacities to meet the future needs of an advanced joint force. So these recommendations are structured around a more complex and less friendly Arctic with increased geopolitical rivalry and overlapping territorial claims, and growing polarization in general with the major global powers. However, these same recommendations are relevant for more peaceful times, for collaboration around scientific research, search and rescue, disaster response, and more. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Moving on to the next paper, we have Sam Wilson, CSPS Director, who focuses on national security, national policies, and international relations. Sam is presenting his paper titled Leverage and Preserve: Need for DoD to Strengthen Support for U.S. Commercial Space.
Thanks, Jordan. Hey, everybody. So I will be presenting this chapter on leveraging and preserving commercial space, but I should note that I'm just one of several authors. I want to recognize Bill Chen, Mindy Han, and Sarah Georgian, who has sadly left Aerospace. And I also want to mention Andrew Berglund, who served as editor for this piece. Next slide, please. So many US commercial space companies benefited from an investment environment that I would characterize as exceptional. Here you can see the general growth in venture capital investment, which rose steadily beginning in 2008, culminating in a peak in 2021. From that peak, it then dropped precipitously, nearly 50% from 2021 to 2023. And venture capital investment is just one example of these broader trends. SPACs, special purpose acquisition companies, tell a similar story. And our chapter has a good graphic of this, although we don't have it here. In 2020, SPACs became a significant fundraising vehicle. And for space companies, several firms that were founded just 5 to 10 years prior grew quickly and went public through SPACs. These include Planet Labs, Spire Global, Terran Orbital, and AST Space Mobile. From 2021 to 2023, from its peak, SPAC funding dropped 97%. Next slide, please. So for the Department of Defense, this this exceptional investment environment over the last several years, I think presents a huge opportunity. The Department of Defense can leverage commercial services and capabilities that offer attractive national security and defense applications. The DoD can use these compelling services and systems without having had paid for the development costs of building those capabilities from scratch. It also presents, I think, a pressing challenge, right? These companies need revenue. Commercial space companies not only now have much less private and public investment that they can draw from, the commercial markets for many space capability areas cannot yet sustain these companies. As Jamie mentioned, firms across many capability areas are dependent on government revenue. not unlike how aviation firms prior to World War II were reliant on US government airmail contracts. So this is an urgent need, right? And DoD embracing partnerships with commercial companies and putting them on contract may mean DoD being the biggest customer or making up most of the revenue for a particular firm. That's okay, right? In fact, we have a section in this chapter all about defending the idea of anchor tenancy. Using commercial services and capabilities to a greater extent is good acquisition policy and good industrial policy for DoD. Without consistent government demand, many US commercial space firms that offer valuable defense applications may not survive. With the right funding and approach, DoD can ensure it can use these assets for defense purposes in the longer term. And doing so will not only save the department the money and time that would otherwise be spent to build additional custom systems from scratch, it would also help preserve and leverage US competitive advantages in commercial space. Thanks, and back to you, Jordan.
Sam, thank you so much. Providing insights on how to grapple with the space regulatory regime, we have Dr. Brian Weeden, the director in CSPS, who leads the commercial and civil policy and regulatory team. Brian's paper is titled Space Regulatory Reform is a Wicked Problem Still Worth Tackling.
Thank you, Jordan. Hello, everyone. In this chapter, my co-author and I looked at the topic of the regulatory regime used by the U.S. government to provide oversight of its private sector space activities. This is an important issue because, as Sam mentioned, commercial space has seen a lot of investment and growth over the last couple of decades, and government agencies are increasingly looking to leverage commercial capabilities for their own missions. At the same time, there are increased concerns as to how this rapid growth of commercial space could harm the long-term sustainable use of space for everyone. The regulatory regime the U.S. puts in place is the main way to ensure that we can get the most benefit out of commercial space while mitigating those sustainability challenges. In this chapter, we looked across 6 different regulatory subtopics, which you can see summarized on this slide: remote sensing, commercial space launch, commercial human spaceflight, export controls, novel space activities under the rubric of mission authorization, and space traffic management. This chart summarizes how each of these areas has had attempted reforms by multiple administrations or Congresses over the last 30 years. There have been some important successes in that period. I'll note that during the Obama administration, there was a very successful major reform done to the export control regime. And during the Trump administration, there was a very successful reform of the remote sensing licensing regime. But many of the other attempts listed on this chart either didn't result in meaningful change or resulted in a change that did not lead to better outcomes. And that's because regulatory reform is what we call in the policy world a wicked problem, meaning it's complex to define, has many stakeholders with different priorities and incentives, and no easy or clear solution. Next slide, please. All that said, we still feel it is important for the next U.S. administration to continue efforts to reform or modernize all of these different regulatory areas. And that's because there are 3 potential failure scenarios, by which we mean less than optimal outcomes that we hope to avoid. One is a scenario where the next administration doesn't do anything, and there is a continued lack of certainty, particularly with regard to the oversight and licensing of new space activities that we're seeing emerging from the commercial sector. The second failure scenario is one where we put in place new or retain existing overly cumbersome regulations that stifle the growth and innovation we need to see in the commercial space sector. And a third failure scenario is one where the US government decides not to provide much oversight at all, and thereby denying the certainty or the credibility that we could have in space and potentially leading to the overuse of space that leads to long-term damage. Next slide, please. To help avoid those outcomes, our chapter discusses 4 main recommendations. First, we reinforce the urgent need for action on this issue. We are running out of road to kick this can down. The next administration needs to not only examine these issues across all 6 of these areas, but to take action to try and address them. And it should happen early in the term. Second, in taking that action, the next White House will need to decide what can be done at the agency level and what requires full interagency process. Moving everything into the interagency process will take up far too much time and effort. Third, while announcing policy decisions is important and gets the most attention, implementation is even more important and needs as much, if not more, political capital put behind it. Finally, the next administration will need to engage early, often, and constructively with Congress, as very few aspects of regulatory reform can be addressed solely by the executive branch. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Our next paper is Space Sustainability in the Context of Contested Space, presented by Greg Henning, an engineering manager in debris and disposal.
Thank you, Jordan. I'll be presenting today for myself and my co-author, Marlon Sorge. When we talk about space sustainability, we have to keep in mind that, space is a asset that belongs to everyone. We have defense, civil, commercial space all operating up there. And since the last time we did a space agenda paper, the landscape of space has changed drastically, particularly in LEO. The amount of traffic up there has grown significantly. And in addition to that, we can talk about things from the perspective of congestion of all the new satellite and new traffic going on up there. At the same time, we've seen an increase in the likelihood of conflict in space. And so we also need to think about things from the context of contested space. On the slide that came up here, the figure at the bottom of the page really illustrates the main problem that we're going to see with sustainability, and that is debris and the potential for debris to be created. When we talk about congested space, increased traffic, large constellations, there's a lot of things going on there that could lead to more debris and less sustainability. In the short term, all that extra traffic just simply means there's an increased likelihood of collisions between objects. The collision avoidance maneuver capability in order to deal with all the objects on orbit and all the other operators has to respond more quickly, probably has to be automated in most cases when you're looking at large constellations, and can become a burden on those systems. When those systems launch, there's a higher likelihood of failure of adding mass to the system through failures. There's always debris left on orbit from launch systems. And so as that stuff increases, and you're looking at this chart here, the stuff on the right are these large intact objects. We can see them, we can track them, we can avoid them if we have collision avoidance capabilities, but they add to the risk of those things colliding with each other and creating more smaller debris. As you move to the left, you get into that smaller debris regime where you might not be able to track it. In fact, below 10 centimeters in LEO approximately, we do not have the capability to reliably track objects. But those objects are moving fast enough and are big enough to still end the life of a satellite. So there's a growing danger there through breakups that could add to that population. Below that, there's even exponentially more of smaller objects that can also continue to damage missions as you go. So congested space on its own is already giving us the potential for that. When we look at contested space, we think of things like cyber attacks on satellites that will render them disabled, which puts them in the category of large derelict objects that could potentially become debris. There's also ASAT tests. We've seen over the last decade and a half or so a handful of anti-satellite tests, which completely destroy a satellite and add significantly to the debris on orbit. So those things combined, more stuff on orbit, the potential for conflict on orbit is a something that doesn't just add, right? It's not just the sum of those negative effects. There is the combination of those things are more than just the sum. We can go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the recommendations, right? So we've laid out the challenge here. We know that we have more stuff on space and we have the danger of conflict in space. So what can policymakers do? Policymakers should implement steps now to ensure a robustly sustainable space operating environment over the long term. If we don't act now on these things, this shared asset, the shared resource of space could become unusable. And there are just so many things, not just scientific, civil, commercial, space, weather forecasting and everything that we need and we have to keep safe in space. These steps should include both improved debris mitigation measures. And when we talk about that, we talk about the amount of, regulations that say how quickly should you re-enter your satellite? How much reliability should you have on your satellite to make it to end of life and to dispose through atmospheric reentry or going to graveyard orbits? And so the government has to look very closely at those kinds of regulations and figure out what needs to be done, because the rules of 5 years and before simply aren't going to be enough. On top of that, the U.S. Efforts like the U.S. moratorium on direct ascent ASAT testing to limit the impacts of contested space are also critical. There may be unavoidable situations in the future, but right now there should not be testing of that sort of activity. Finally, consideration of congested and contested space effects in defining responsible space operations behaviors can preserve the practical usability of space. I think I've already kind of said that, but just to foot stomp this, the time is now to act on sustainability. We're on this cusp of very large growth and congestion in space and the possibility of conflict. And so with that, I will pass it back to Jordan. Thank you.
Greg, thank you. Our final paper that we're presenting is titled Moonstruck: International Aspirations in Cislunar Space, presented by Dr. Angie Buckley, a technical fellow in CSPS who focuses on exploration, society, and the future.
Thank you, Jordan, and thanks everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us this morning. I'm going to talk about the paper Moonstruck and international aspirations in cislunar space. Before I dive in, I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Colleen Stover, and extend my appreciation to, Marlon Sorge for being editor for this chapter. So if we could move to the first slide, please. So there's been a huge expansion of interest in cislunar space recently. And that was really kind of spurred by the discovery and the confirmation of water ice in the southern polar regions of the moon. And this was published in a Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences paper back in August of 2018. That was an important step because if you've got water ice, you can convert that to water, which is useful, oxygen to breathe, and hydrogen, which can be used for rocket fuel. So there's a lot of interest in cislunar space. Before I go into any more details, let's define quickly what we mean by cislunar space. There's a little diagram on the chart there that shows the Earth in the center of the bullseye. The geosynchronous orbit is shown there, and that orbit is at 36,000 kilometers altitude. And then to give you an idea of how big an area we're talking about, or a volume that we're talking about, the cislunar space definition that we're using is everything beyond geo, out past the Earth-Moon Lagrange point 2, out to about 550,000 kilometers. This is a volume in space. This is not just an area, it's a volume. And cislunar space is about 1,000 times larger than the space enclosed by the geosynchronous orbits. So there really has been a confluence of international interest across the board in leveraging cislunar space for a number of reasons. The main players right now are the United States and China, India, Japan, and Russia, but there's probably more than a dozen, maybe 20 additional countries that are actively planning missions in cislunar space. In fact, there's 130 robotic missions planned between now and 2033. And that's a lot, because if you think about since 2010, we've only had 24 lunar missions in cislunar space. So the main reasons that it's important for us to explore cislunar space is exploration. You'll note that 3 countries have plans to put people on the moon as part of their cislunar exploration. United States in 2026, China by 2030, and India by 2040. So reason for that is exploration, learn more about the moon, and also from a standpoint of expanding human presence in space, the moon is seen as a really good stepping stone to get to Mars. A lot of potential for science, everything from astrophysics to studying the radiation effects on humans and hardware, and even radio astronomy in the shielded zone of the moon that we can't do from anywhere on Earth. Now, there's a lot of interest also from the commercial enterprise. And if you'll look on the right, there's a diagram that kind of calls out a number of the areas in which they're interested. Everything from providing infrastructure to these outposts on the moon to harvesting potentially valuable resources that would include water, helium-3, and rare earth metals. And some of this stuff can be brought back to Earth and used. But we have to remember that until a business case can be closed around this, it's not going to be feasible. So commercial companies are looking at how to do that. A very important area is security and safety. Space situational awareness is hard in cislunar space because the orbits are very unpredictable because of the orbital mechanics that are driven by the presence of the moon and the Earth and the spacecraft themselves. So it's hard to get conjunction estimates. If you get conjunction estimates, conjunction is where 2 objects would come together and potentially crash into each other. Those are not going to be super reliable. We can't see what's going on the far side of the moon. China has already done 2 missions on the far side of the moon, even did a sample return mission on the far side, which is really cool. But in terms of being able to watch what's going on, we do not have any assets in place apart from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter that has only limited visibility on the far side of the moon. Security is super important in terms of protecting our investments and our assets. And finally, governance, coming up with norms of behavior, rules of the road. The Outer Space Treaty dictates that you can't really claim sovereignty over a particular area or anything in space, but it doesn't address how to handle when 2 entities want to use the same area on the moon or same orbits or whatever. So we need to take an active role in that. So if we could please go to the last slide. Great. Here's some of the recommendations that have come out of this study. The United States really needs to continue to invest in lunar exploration and exploitation through the NASA Artemis campaigns, the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program, and some of the national security missions that are in place to establish foundational interoperable cislunar infrastructure. Second thing is situational awareness. We've got to establish situational awareness capabilities in cislunar space and then enhance those so that we can keep up with what's going on, not only with our own assets, but understand what other nations are doing both in and on and around the moon. And finally, governance. United States needs to take a leadership role in establishing and contributing to these government agreements, especially norms of behavior, We want to promote sustainable science, exploration, and resource utilization. And we don't want to clutter up cislunar space with space debris, similar to what we seem to be doing in low Earth orbit. So as long as we can maintain our enthusiasm and motivation, I think we can maintain our place of leadership in space. And hopefully we will find paths to cooperate, or at least have a healthy co-opetition with other nations that are extending their operations into lunar space. And let's take an initiative to lead humanity in a good direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie, and to all of our presenters for providing additional insights into your papers. We're now going to move into the question and answer section of our media briefing. And as a reminder, please drop your questions in the chat, and we will have one of our experts provide their insights. So while this Q&A continues in the chat, I would like to start us off with a question for Jamie that I received from a participant directly. Space Agenda 2025 briefly references the importance of a diverse workforce and focuses on equitable access to education in fostering innovation as the primary policy recommendation. However, this emphasis on DEI appears limited in scope compared to the broader strategic policy discussions. Does the report's limited focus on these considerations reflect that they are less critical in shaping the future of space sector? Over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Jordan, and appreciate that question from an audience member. That's a topic that CSPS has worked on historically. We started with public events engaged on that 5-6 years ago, and there's a 2021 publication that CSPS put out on that. It's also been a terrific topic of conversation with the CSPS Senior Advisory Council, which is a group of very distinguished folks from the space community who help us shape our research. And actually, one outcome from a Senior Advisory Council discussion on exactly that topic was an initiative that was taken up by Aerospace writ large, which was called at the time Space Workforce 2030, and is now operating under Space Workforce for the Future. And that's actually a space sector-wide commitment by many of the major companies in the sector to get after these issues in their hiring practices, in their talent development practices, and in their contributions to education and building the workforce we need for the future. So it is a super important topic. It's one we've worked on quite a bit over the years and remain strongly committed to. If folks aren't familiar with the Space Workforce for the Future initiative, it's a great one to Google search. And if you're in the space sector and your company or organization isn't involved, I'd really strongly encourage you to take a look and reach out to the team that's working on it to become a part of it, because we need all the talent we can get in this sector, especially if the trend lines that are laid out in Space Agenda 2025 come to fruition and we continue to see the growth in applications that we're projecting.
Thank you, Jamie. And this next question addresses commercial themes. The actual ambitions of companies and investors in the sector seem to be downplayed when the incoming administration and Congress could easily see starships on Mars, commercial space stations. So how does Space Agenda 2025 prepare the USG and the rest of the nation for these rapidly developing capabilities?
This is a topic that we probably need to tag team in order to answer, because a number of our scholars are working on issues adjacent to it. So I'll summarize the question as what if things come even faster and more aggressively than we've expected change is even greater and the commercial activities expand. Let me turn first to Sam Wilson, ask him to talk a little bit about the national security side implications, and then I'll ask for Karen Jones's thoughts on the business model questions, and I think Angie Buckley may have a few points to wrap us up on this one.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. And it's a terrific question. And I think it's one of the central themes of the Space Agenda series this year. And you heard, we presented kind of 4 chapters or 4 or 5 chapters today, and 2 of them were specifically on this issue, and all the others touched on this issue too. But yeah, from the DoD side and even on the IC side, we've done, the center's done a lot of work starting with the Space Agenda series last time. So in 2020, we released a paper called Leveraging Commercial Space for National Security Applications, where we argued for DoD and the IC to go further in their use of commercial space for national security. And then we offered a way to kind of how decision makers and folks within the government can make decisions about using commercial space as a service, as a commercial asset that they're buying and then modifying, and then thinking of that in comparison to traditional acquisition, where they build things from scratch. We also had a paper the next year about assessing commercial solutions for government missions, where it went a step further and thought through, once the government has made a decision it wants to use commercial for a particular mission, how should it assess those individual commercial firms that might be offering a service or an asset or a capability? We've also looked on the national security side on some of the risks to commercial actors who are engaging in national security missions. Robin Dickey had a report a couple of years ago thinking about some of the norms, how commercial players have a role in norms development and security norms development. Because these lines between commercial and national security are blurry, right? Because it's the capabilities are valuable for civilian applications and commercial applications and national security applications. And then this year, of course, we have a couple chapters that are focused on this. The one I presented is really kind of thinking about how urgent this is, not just from an acquisition perspective, but also from an industrial policy perspective, given how much tremendous commercial capability exists without necessarily the revenue to support it, to sustain it. And then we also have a chapter, Brian presented. We have another chapter on the DoD side that Jamie and I wrote and Laura Sayers wrote about, how should we transform the budget structure? And that would, among other things, I think, allow for commercial services and assets to be considered as part of trades, make it easier to consider them as part of trades in the budget cycle. So anyway, lots of products we've had on this, lots of public products we've had on this, and it's an area that we're going to continue to publish on.
I'll just add to that the government, as a large volume buyer, has a responsibility in this market. The commercial space market is consolidating quite a bit, lots of inorganic growth. We've seen a lot of mergers and acquisitions. So on the supply side, we're seeing quite a bit of consolidation. We're seeing certain companies with a very, very large command of certain markets. And the government's in the middle of this. How do they operate in a responsible way to ensure that the market that they rely on remains competitive? And that's a rather new challenge for the US government, to undertake that and do it in a way that's fair, equitable, and transparent, particularly if they move towards public-private partnership models going forward. And it's not simply how much of a share of the overall market that any one company commands. It's how they behave as they are involved in that market in terms of fair pricing.
Okay, and I'll make a few comments on the civil space side of things. NASA has actually kind of been leading the charge in incorporating commercial activities into their programs. We know about the commercial space launch programs that they have, that SpaceX and the Dragon fly our astronauts to the International Space Station nowadays. In terms of looking at commercial lunar destinations, NASA speak for space stations, commercial space stations. NASA is really reaching out aggressively to commercial enterprise to propose designs that can be developed and hopefully put in place before the decommissioning of the International Space Station in 2031. And we do have another paper in the Space Agenda 2025 that addresses just that. It's called Mind the Gap. So take a look at that one. But yes, this is really important. The government is going to be required to continue to support these kinds of endeavors. We're ways from having even a LEO space economy that won't be dependent on the government across all facets of the government to make that happen. So really important. We do have a lot of publications that address these issues. So feel free to take a look on the CSPS website, and you easily find those. Over.
In an interest of time, we will take one more question. So if there are any final questions, please drop them in the chat now. And if not, we will pass it over to Jamie for closing remarks.
I thought I had seen one more that we probably wanted to address, Jordan, which was Andy Sharma's question regarding need for holistic policy framework. Let's maybe take a moment to catch that one, and then with a quick answer, and then I'll make my closing remarks. I'll start this off, and I'll open the door to any of my colleagues that want to jump in. So Andy's question is essentially, given the complexity of space governance, is Space Agenda 2025 calling for a coordinated whole of government approach across defense, civil, commercial, international elements? And how do we get to coherent policy implementation across the multiple government agencies? This is another terrific and fundamental question. I think Dr. Weeden's paper on regulatory approaches is the one that gets most closely to it, but Sam and others work on the commercial side capture elements of this as well. I'll summarize briefly and say that one of the items we recognize with this project is that the decision to lodge responsibility for a particular activity, whether it's licensing or other regulatory activities, in an interagency process, or put differently, to say that agency X is responsible for this activity in coordination with long list of other agencies. That approach, which you could call a federated type approach to the problem set, of its nature will add a delay in responsiveness. So these issues are obviously incredibly cross-cutting. We don't have a Department of Space, nor are we arguing for one here that unifies this in a single cabinet agency or organization. But with these cross-cutting issues, the process of building consensus on a way forward is time-consuming. And so Brian does a nice job of laying out the need to get to pretty good rather than perfect on a lot of these decisions. Brian, do you want to add any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, well, I'll just add a couple more things. And I added a couple things in the chat as well. Obviously, yes, ideally we would have a whole of government strategy aligned on priorities and goals and how to implement it. That is extremely difficult to do because the US government is made up of dozens of agencies with different equities and different interests and different perspectives. And that's just on the executive branch side. And of course, you have Congress, which is a constitutionally independent and equally powerful actor to the executive branch that has its own multitude of constituencies and interests and objectives. So, while there is a U.S. national space policy that gets updated every administration or two, and that often comes with an implementation strategy that is agreed to across the executive branch. Getting agreement at that level is very difficult, but Congress is independent, and we shouldn't forget that. And that's sort of an additional feature of the US system that we need to keep in mind. And that's why in our chapter, we talk about the real need for close engagement between the executive branch and Congress, because neither one can tackle these problems by themselves. And there is a need for alignment on a lot of these issues.
I guess, Jamie, I'll just jump in there just real quick, just in terms of contextualizing it in the introduction too. We spent a lot of time choosing our words carefully in the introduction, and you realize we don't say whole of government integrated strategy. We say strengthened clarity on a vision. And I think that really is maybe the difference, right? The interagency and all the components across the government have multiple strategies, plural, and that's actually a good thing. We're designed like that. But having clarity on where we want to go and how space serves that, I think, is really going to help catalyze all the issues that we have at our front door and that we need to work for the future.
Thank you very much, Kara. All right, well, that brings us near to the end of our allotted time here. I want to thank everybody for joining us for the rollout of this report. I think we had well over 200 people registered to attend today's event. 7 or 8 years ago, if you had held an event talking about space policy issues, you would have been able to convene it in a small office, I think, in many cases. So I am just very excited by the level of attention to these topics. I think it speaks to the importance of space and the excitement and enthusiasm surrounding space right now. Aerospace as an institution, the Center for Space Policy and Strategy as a part of Aerospace, we're not in the business of telling people what to do, but we do think we can help to clarify and crystallize the complex policy issues facing the nation. And that's what we've tried to do with Space Agenda 2025. We look forward to following up with you as attendees here individually, and we are always happy to bring additional detail on this research and on the work of the scholars at CSPS to your events, to your private conversations. This is a big enterprise, increasingly so, increasingly complex, as Kara noted and Brian noted, and it's by collaboration that we get to better outcomes. So thank you again for your time. Thank you to Angie for her hard work in editing this product. Thank you to the whole team that has written it and pulled together events like today. And we look forward to this being a part of the national conversation and the global conversation in the months and years to come. Have a great day, everybody.